The last topic in the class we're going to cover is an even bigger change of pace, I would say, than what we've been covering the last few weeks. So I'm just going to introduce this at the most basic level. So I want to talk to you about how to go about creating graphical user interfaces. So there are kind of two choices with the built-in functionality in MATLAB with making these graphical user interfaces. And what's a graphical user interface? It's just basically a way for the user to manipulate any sort of program. And so in this case, we're going to be creating it with a lot of these different kind of really standard buttons and things, and displays and plots and all that. But for example, like what's a user interface? Like PowerPoint here is a user interface. This is I can go and switch slides. I can go and kind of click buttons and do things with it. That's a graphical user interface, because at its core this is just programming, and realistically, like you could code everything here in PowerPoint if you were good enough, or if you had enough time to learn the language and build it. You could do everything from DOS prompt. That's the way kind of computers originated, right? But for most of us, including myself, like I don't know how to do that. I'm nothing more than a user of most things. I know how to do MATLAB programming, and that's mostly it. And so for those people that can't even do that, making a graphical user interface in MATLAB to perform certain functions for you, so that someone could just open an app and click things and have it do a specific process, like maybe run an experiment or things like that. There's a couple ways to do that. Like I said, there's two. There's Guide, which is a design environment in MATLAB. That's still function based. That's pretty solidly what we've kind of been doing all this time. And so that's actually one that you all could probably learn a little bit more intuitively if you really need to spend the time. The other part of that is that it's actually getting less and less supported as MATLAB continues, for whatever reason. I know it's fairly widely used. What we're going to talk about this week is how to use App Designer, which it provides less functionality, I would say, overall. It's probably going to more and more is going to get added to it as it goes. But the reason we want to switch to it is because it's using a slightly different way of thinking. It uses class-based, object-oriented programming, which we touched on like a very small amount in this class. So we went over interactive plotting and things. That was object-based, object-oriented, class-based programming. So when you went in and you defined a variable, then a variable dot some class. So going specifically to plots, if you plotted a curve, and we usually use the variable h, right? So if you did h dot line width, that was a line width class that you would try to evaluate and put in some value to, right? And so that's object-based, class-based programming. And so we want to use the same thing in order to create these GUIs. And so I just want to show you the first example, which is going to be really straightforward. It's going to be, I'm going to have a gauge here, like this kind of hemispherical gauge or semicircular gauge. And then I want to have a slider. And so all I want to do is I want to connect the two. I want to, when I change this slider, it changes the gauge. And that's all I want to show you in this first video, and how you do that. And I want to start to show you how to use these interactive object-oriented programming language in MATLAB in order to create these. And I'm going to show you a few things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a new app using App Designer. There's a couple ways to do that. So if I open MATLAB here, I could go new app, and that will open the App Designer. That's probably the easiest way to do it. The other way you can do it is you can go to this apps tab, and so as you can see, they've definitely started supporting this a lot more. Every iteration of MATLAB since 2016, I think, has kind of been adding more and more. And so you could click on Design App here, and that should, yep, it opens the App Designer dialog. And so I just want to open a blank app and just do something pretty simple. And so how do I grab the gauge and the slider? Well, you look at this whole App Designer area here, and this center part under design views, there's two tabs here. There's a code view and a design view. We're going to deal with the design view for now, and this is kind of your canvas. Much like in Simulink, we had kind of like that blank canvas you could drag and drop different blocks onto. You can do the same thing here, so it should start to seem familiar to you. And I know I'm going to need a slider, so let me grab that here. And I'm not going to play too much with how things look. I just want to grab these. I have a slider, and then I'm going to scroll down. You have a lot of components in these component libraries. So here's the common ones. I'm going to go to instrumentation and grab the semicircular gauge here and drag it, click and drag, exactly like we did in Simulink, right? So I'm going to have this gauge here, and I'm just going to delete some of these labels for now. Whoops. So to delete the label, you actually have to like select the label, delete it, select the label, delete it. And I want to draw your attention to a few things. So I have this right now, and I want to connect the two. I'm going to tell you that there's not an easy way to do this at the design view level. And that's just because you have to actually connect the code that is generated for these two things. All right, so if that's not the case, what exactly can I do at this level? So one of the things I like to do at this level is you have this component browser over here. And so in this case, you have a variable name effectively called app, and that is like your highest level class. And all of these other components are held in basically classes of this in different values. And so that is like the second. So if you app.slider, that is effectively the variable that's holding the slider in here. And then app.gauge is what's holding all the values in this gauge. And so if I click on here, you can look under this inspector area and see, all right, here are all of the things I could pull out of this. So much like when I was teaching you how to do plots, you could go in and look for like line properties, figure properties, axes properties. So you can actually just click on one of these and see, all right, what properties can I change? And what happens when I change them? So for example, if I change the value area of this gauge, what happens? So if I change it to 20. If you look, it moves the gauge up to 20. And so that's going to tell me, all right, maybe if I want to connect these two, if I want to make it so that when I change the value of this slider, right, it changes the value of the gauge, I probably need to be doing something in the code somewhere that changes this value for the gauge and connecting it to the value class of the slider, or the value variable, basically, of the slider. Okay, so I need to learn how to do that. And so how would I pull those out? I would do app.slider.value, much like we did when we were messing with the plotting tools, right? As you did. So if you wanted to grab the font name, you did axes.fontname, right? And then set that equal to something. So in this case, we're going to do app.slider.value. That's basically the class we're pulling out, and the app.slider is effectively like the object. And we're going to set those equal to each other. And so that's all well and good, and I could go in the code and do that. But what I really want to do is that when I run this, let me show you what happens if you go and run this app. And I'm going to call this week. I'm going to call this example 1. So I'm going to try to continue on from this example and build on to it. I'll say video 1. I'm going to call it video 1 because this is going to be tied to this first video. And so if I run it, what happens? Give it a moment. This UI figure comes up, and now I can manipulate this a little bit. I can't manipulate the gauge because all the gauge does is it doesn't allow input, it just outputs basically values and things. But I can move this slider. That really doesn't do anything though, right? Because it's actually not even changing it over here. It's changing the value internal to this app, which is being run right now. So like in the end, what you'd want like something that could do a lot of sophisticated things, maybe buttons that would push to run certain functions and then plot to this user interface or save files or things like that, right? You want something that's someone that doesn't know anything about anything they're doing, right? They could open up this app and they could run all of the simulations they needed to, run all the codes they needed to do some sort of analysis, and then it'll have built-in functions to it. But right now we're just doing this simple thing, and all I want to do is connect these two, and obviously right now they're not connected. I'm moving this back and forth. It's doing nothing to the gauge. And so what I want to do is I want to add what's called a callback. And so in a callback, there are actually callbacks in Simulink, and I didn't really cover them much at all, if it really, I don't think. And so what these callbacks do is they allow you, when something happens effectively to like the slider or the gauge or whatever. I don't even know if there are already callbacks to the gauge. There isn't, because you can't interact with it. But basically, what a callback is that if something is interacted with, it allows you to add code that gets run when it happens. And so, like, for example, a callback is what you would use if you used a button to do some sort of, to run some sort of code or something, right? But in this case, I want to add a value changed function. So I want effectively to happen is that when I change the value of the slider in that when the GUI is being run, I want it to change the gauge. Let's add that in. And so if you notice, it brought me over to the code view and showed me this and brought me to this function here. And so it's a literal function. And so that should be familiar to you at this point. And what it did is it assigned a value here, a variable, to app.slider.value, which, remember, under the inspector tab of the slider here, that is the value where you are basically on the slider. And so basically what it's saying is that when you change the value of the slider, it creates this variable. Okay, so now how do I go and change that for the gauge? And so all I need to do now is I have a variable that equals value. I can go in and I can say, all right, I need app.gauge.value. That's the value of the position where you are along the slider. I need to change that. And so I can actually do that. I can do app.gauge, and if you look, it's letting me kind of autofill things. .value is equal to value under lowercase. It's the variable right here. And if you notice, it's actually helping me kind of autofill things. Those can be helpful. It can also be kind of frustrating. And so what it's doing now, and this is all I needed to do to connect the two, is I added this callback, this function, for when slider value changed, right? So when the slider value changes. And all that is fed into it is the event, which is basically that something's being changed, or the app. The app is the full, basically, top view of the entire thing that's being run. And so that app is holding in all of the values of everything, basically, for the slider and the gauge. And so now what's going to happen is I'm going to, when I move it and drop it, basically I've changed the value of the slider. It's now going to change the value of the gauge as well. So let's go ahead and check it. And so now if I slide this to 60, look, it moves the gauge to 60. So that's great. That it does exactly what I wanted it to do. It does. It changes the gauge based on how I change the slider. But the annoying thing is, though, is that it waits until I drop it, right? If you notice, it waits until I drop it to change the gauge corresponding with the slider. So there's another callback I could have added. So if I go in here, I can actually change. So that now that I've created this slider value changed callback. It's a function, and I can say, all right, don't use that for value changed function, which basically means the value changed function is the function that you run if you change the value of the slider. And so I can go back and hit no callback, and now if I run it, it shouldn't do anything. See, because I basically disabled that. But the nice thing is that I could go back and add it again. I could do that. Or I could add another callback if I wanted to have another function at my disposal to use somewhere else in this GUI eventually. What I want to show you is what if I wanted to change that slider, and as I change the slider, right, as I drag it, it changes the gauge. It doesn't wait until I let go of it, until I unclick it. And so that's what value changing function is. It's basically as it changes, it runs the callback, right? So every time that thing changes, as I'm dragging it, it'll run the callback and change the gauge as well. And so obviously that's going to be more computationally intensive because it's always running basically. But you could want to use it. And so what I could do is I could use this same function, right? But let me just add a new value changing function. Callback, and the reason you have to do that is because now instead of feeding the app.slider.value, which has actually technically not changed because I didn't let go of it yet, I'm using this event, the second input, which is basically what's the event that's happening? The slider is being changed, and that's kind of like more of a dynamic storage variable, I guess you could say. And so now I just do the same thing. Is I set changing value here. Is being updated as I move that slider, and so I'm going to do app.gauge.value. The same thing is going to be equal to changing value now. And so now, as long as this is enabled, and I go to run it again, as I change this, you see it updates it real time, basically. All right, and so that's going to be your introduction to callbacks and the app developer in general. And so there are step-by-step instructions in here on how to do all these things, right? So if you need a review, or if you want to walk through it yourself as well, you can do that. So what I want you to do is, here's the first in-class problem. Is I want you to make a GUI that does the following. It includes an edit box and a gauge. You need to make sure you use the numeric edit box. It's going to be one key there. And so I've actually given you a little bit of a solution. I'll probably remove that from the actual online one. What I want you to do is to make it look like this app on the left, have a gauge and an edit field. And then what I want you to do is do the same thing I just did for the slider, but do it for the edit field. Try to figure it out on your own. Make sure you understand how to do that, how to add these different components into your app, and how to actually add a callback and connect the two. And that's what I want you to basically test that skill with this problem. So go ahead and do that. Get that prepared, and then you will submit that as usual for the in-class problems.